I had a very interesting problem when I was doing a movie called The Quarrel, because The Quarrel is based on a short story called Mein Krieg mit Herschel Resigner, which is by a great Yiddish writer that I'm sure you know, called Chaim Grada. Now, Chaim Grada was a friend of my father's in Montreal before he actually decided to go back to Poland, where he was more revered. He was just a nobody in Montreal in the 50s. So, and he kind of became my godfather for a while. But by ironic chance, his story was adapted into a movie called The Quarrel, and it's about these two characters who knew each other in yeshiva before the war, one of whom his father ran the yeshiva, and the other of whom was his best friend, who read forbidden books, whether it was Shakespeare or Chekhov or whatever he did, and got kicked out. But it was a much more brilliant student. But he left. And they each got married, they each had children, children and their wives were murdered in the Holocaust, and by chance they meet in the story. I think it's in Paris, but here in this case it was Montreal, and they meet in Montreal by accident. How? The artist is, I think, writing for the Daily Jewish Forward, and he's gone to Montreal on a lecture, and he got laid the night before, and he wants to return a necklace to the woman he slept with, and they're going to meet in the park. He happens to go to the park on Yom Kippur, and he sees tashlich, which is when you take crumbs out of your pocket and put it into a moving, living stream. He sees a Hasidic Jew with his congregation of young men doing this, and he recognizes that man with the beard as his old friend from before the war, and they embrace and they reminisce, but then the quarrel starts again. And the quarrel essentially in that situation is my character, who has closed himself off from the world and created yeshiva because the only way the modern Jew, in that case modern being 1948 or whenever that took place, the only way they can survive is to separate themselves from murderous non-Jews. Whereas the artist feels that the only answer to the Holocaust is inclusion. So inclusion and exclusion, which is a postmodern Jewish problem usually embodied in the same person. In this case, it's two people. All right. The director was Israeli, Eli Cohen, a really nice man, but no ear for accents. And he's hired a dialect coach from Brooklyn, from New York. Now, I said, I'm not going to accept this role. It's a really interesting story about the quarrel. I said, I'm not going to accept it. I've never told this story publicly, but I don't mind anymore. I said, I'm not going to accept the role unless I know who's playing the other character. First of all, I wanted to play the artist. I didn't relate at all to the Hasidic, obviously I wanted to play the artist. But Eli, who's brilliant, said, no, going against it would be very good for you. Very, very good for you, the conflict. He was really right about that. But I wasn't sure. I had to talk to my father about it, and there's a whole masa about that, there's a whole story about that. Okay, but first of all, I said, okay, but I'm not accepting the role until I know who is playing the other role. And they said, that's understandable. So everybody they came to me with, I approved. They came to me with a bunch of actors, and I thought they were great. They didn't approve them. Finally, I had other work. And I said, listen, there's a very good friend of mine. He's not Jewish. His name is Robert Thompson, R.H. Thompson, who I've grown up with in the theater. He's a brilliant actor. And you'll have a shorthand, because we've been friends for many years. And you don't need a Jew to play this role. He's an artist. He's red-haired. It doesn't matter, but he's got a very Scottish Jewish face, and he could be a red-haired Jew, and he's brilliant. And they said, well, you can't have approval of I said, I don't have approval. Go cast two other people. You haven't hired me. And they said, but you can't have approval. I said, you're not hearing me. I haven't been hired. You don't owe me any money. This is who I'm going to do this with. The time is running short. Well, I can't be blackmailed. I said, you're not being blackmailed. Cast somebody else in both roles. I had power, but no financial power. They had to cast him, or they weren't going to. He was brilliant. They were very lucky to have him. He was great. So RH and I ended up doing this. So they hired a dialect coach for him. He wanted one. I said, okay, but this guy's going to teach you an accent that's kind of New York Jewish and not really European Jewish. So what's European Jewish? I said, you don't want me to speak like my father. You want the feeling that they're talking Yiddish. He said, yes. I said, well, in order to do that, I'm going to do it for you now. And the way you would do it is with a slight melody and a slight overpronunciation of the way you're speaking. This is now me as if I was speaking Yiddish, and you would hear it slightly in the melody, but I'm not doing any kind of particular accent that you can really like borscht belt accent, but you have a feeling and a flavor of the accent. And I know how to do this really well. I grew up with it, and I'm fluent in Yiddish as a first language. And what did Eli Cohen say? I don't hear you doing an accent. I said, it's because you're an Israeli. So he had the dialect coach with earphones on, and I said, not around me. I have nothing against him. And let RH. So I remember having done this thing where I had this huge monologue about the death of my father. I did in a single take. And I watched him talk to the dialect coach who had earphones on. He came over to me and said, you have to do more accent. And I said, here's what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to direct me as an actor, but you're not allowed to talk to me about accents because you have no ear for it, and neither does he. He can work with RH, but not with me. And this character is from New York anyway, even though we grew up together in Europe. It makes sense. Let him have a bit of an American Jewish accent and let him teach him that, because he would have a flavor of it maybe because he's lived in New York all these years. So it works for him. But for me to do a 6-minute take about the death of my father, and for you to come over to me because you've spoken to him, because you can't hear it, and he says, I don't hear an accent, and then you come over and direct me, that's not going to be allowed. We have 15 days of shooting. You can't do that. He said, you can't stop me from directing you. I said, watch me. I'm not allowing it. Fire me. But that's not going to happen. He never directed me again after the first day. Never talked to me. I met him many years later. And he says he teaches classes in Israel as an example of how wrong he was about how he did this, and he paid me this compliment. I said, there was nothing I could do. My director became my friend RH. I would ask him about every take, and he directed me. He never directed me for a second. He was too, he had too big of an ego. But the problem was, you're talking about accents and how I grew up and how it affected my work. There's a perfect example of how it affected my work. I wasn't going to allow something that I knew growing up in my blood, in my veins, in my skin, in every fiber of my body. I knew how to do that flavor that I just did for you, effortlessly, because I grew up with it. I grew up with those tones. I know not to do a Jewish accent from the Borscht Belt if I'm playing this, which is what they wanted me to do, which I wasn't going to do with that movie. It would have just been a farce. Instead, I did a slight flavor of an accent, so you could just hear a little bit of it, and it sort of goes away, and you would just accept it after a while. But I wasn't going to do a comedy routine, which is where they were pushing me to go so they could hear it, so they could be satisfied that they'd done their jobs. I was going to kill the movie. The movie was too important to me. I knew the story. It meant a lot to me. The story, it was my father's best friend. Chaim Grad is a great writer. Who knows how long this story will last? I wasn't going to destroy it for the sake of their egos, and I refused, and I was a really easy actor to get along with, except for then, you know.